Today on the Perception and Action podcast, Perception and Action Journal Club number 20, Sport Practitioners as Sport Ecology Designers, how ecological dynamics has progressively changed perceptions of skill acquisition in the sporting habitat. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, an all-Aussie, save me of course, version of the Journal Club. I'm joined by Damian Farrow, Alex Lascu, Derek Panchuk, and Carl Woods to discuss the interesting new article, Sports Practitioners as Sport Ecology Designers. We discuss topics including the shift from the coach as an instructor to the coach as a designer, the challenges of hands-off coaching, do coaches need to understand skill acquisition theory, and the importance of having a consistent purpose across the different disciplines in coaching, via a department of methodology possibly. Hope you enjoy. Okay, I think we're live, so welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception and Action Journal Club. It's my real pleasure to be joined by a group of people from all the way on the other side of the world, where it's almost, how many degrees did we figure out? 70 degrees cooler than where I am. From Australia. So we didn't want to leave Australia out of this. So we've got a great group of people that we're going to talk about a paper looking at kind of the changing role of coaches. So I'm going to go to do this. I thought I would let's let everybody introduce themselves. So maybe I'll start right next to me, Carl, in the middle. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, Rob, thanks for the opportunity to come onto the podcast. I think it's been a great platform in this period of everyone seeming to be working from home to kind of stay connected and at least understand what others are doing around the place. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to jump on and have a chat. So I'm my current position, I'm a senior research fellow in skill acquisition at Victoria University, based within the Institute of Health and Sport. Here in looks like sunny Melbourne today. Prior to that, I spent the last few years within the Australian Football League, kind of as like a manager of skill acquisition, coaching sciences at the Port Adelaide Football Club based in Adelaide. So that was a really great opportunity, change of pace from an academic side of things. And prior to that, I was based up in North Queensland in Townsville as an academic at James Cook University. So I've kind of darted around the place, progressively finding my way into colder climates as I go. So at the moment I'm kind of in this middle zone between this kind of world between the academic side of things. I still work with Port Power, so I'm kind of in this blended space between both the applied and I guess the theoretical, which as we get to it is probably a bit of a manifestation in that paper, I think. So it's a bit about who I am at least.
Great. And Derek.
Okay. I help coaches build bridges between the science of learning and the art of coaching so they can discover new ways to develop talent and teams. I am a independent consultant at the moment. I've started down the academic route. I'm Canadian. You can probably tell by the non-Australian accent. But ended up taking a job at Victoria University, which is where sort of came across Damo and where Carl is now. Great place to work. Ended up taking a job as the national lead for skill acquisition at the AIS. Like any good government agency, they go through restructures every few years. Made some big changes in sort of how they work with servicing sports teams and whatnot. And now I've sort of found myself working on my own. But a big theme through my work, I guess, is taking sort of, I guess, the theoretical knowledge that we've grown in this area of skill acquisition, motor learning, and try and connect dots with that information to coaches. So I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of national teams and currently doing a lot of work with NBA programs, regional and state academies here as well.
Oh, great. That sounds great. And Alex.
Yeah, so I actually started as a very, very young coach because I enjoyed that side of it more than actually playing the game. And then I realized how much of it is out of touch with our experiences. A lot of my coaches were very old school and traditional. And when I walked into my first motor control lecture, I realized there was a whole world of research out there that already matched what I was expecting the coaching world to be. And so once I finished a double of exercise science and psychology, I walked into a PhD scholarship looking at women's sport because we realized that there's no actual foundation to help that specific area despite their ongoing success around the world. And so now I actually study talent development in women's cricket.
Cool. That's really interesting. Yeah, you're right. That is an important angle we need to take, definitely. And last but not least, Damian in the my bottom left.
Hi all. Yeah, Damian Farrow. Well, I reckon everyone else summed up what I do. I'm a bit of what Woodsy talked about. I've come from academia and I'm now working for the Australian Football League in coaching and innovation, and in particular working with our officials or umpires. And prior to that, I still hold a position at Victoria University in the Institute of Health and Sport as a professor in skill acquisition. And a bit like Derek, I spent 18 years at the Australian Institute of Sport in the area of skill acquisition, working with coaches and athletes to, ultimately to try and enhance their skill learning and solve whatever performance problems they have. So I feel like my whole career I've tried to balance the academic and the theoretical with the need for application. And I think I'm most passionate about that in terms of you want to stay well read, but we need to impact those at the coalface. So I think much like Derek's trying to do, and I know all of us are trying to do, that's my history.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you guys are all exemplars of this doing this practice research kind of integration. I think it's really important. I know a lot of people evaluate. So today what we're going to do is talk about something that directly relates to this, and we're going to talk about a paper. And I'm going to put the title up on the screen because it's a mouthful. This is the title of the paper. So we have the lead author here, Carl Woods. This is the title of the paper, Sports Practitioners as Sport Ecology Designers, How Ecological Dynamics Has Progressively Changed Perception of Skill Acquisition, in quotes, which we'll get to, in the sporting habitat. So what I thought we would start with you, Carl, because as I said, you're the lead author on the paper. What I wanted to ask you maybe to start off with is this emphasis on ecology and ecological dynamics and ecological approach. A lot of people, keep using that word, and a lot of people I find wonder why do we keep emphasizing that? And I know that's a big role in this paper. So maybe could you talk a little bit about why is ecology such an important issue for you in this paper?
Yeah, really good point. And I guess it's a massive title and kind of sits somewhat provocatively, I guess. But the whole notion that we tried to push and are trying to push with this kind of series of work in this ecological space is to emphasise the importance, I guess, more so of relations or interactions. So it's not necessarily something that we kind of, traditionally emphasise within the kind of traditional coaching sense, so to speak, in that, I guess the coach has been seen in this light of providing the solutions for the players, providing direction to reorganise some particular phase of play or some particular movement. And we often, I at least often perceive that as kind of like a means to an end, as opposed to the real important element of that is developing an interaction or an engagement between the individual or the organism and their niche within the environment, which effectively is what ecology boils down to. An ecological understanding is how and some particular organism interacts with its environment, how it perceives information, and how it then regulates their actions based upon that perception of information. So I guess this was a bit of a call in sport, at least, to place a greater emphasis on the individual and their emergent interaction, as opposed to the scripting of a play or the kind of repetition of some particular rehearsed and reproducible action that I guess can take its form in many ways. I guess it can in high performance sport, it can at least take its way in structured plays, game models, or it can take more of a nuanced approach on this is how you should perform some particular kick or throw or handball or whatever it might be. So rather than focusing more on that, this paper was perhaps more of a call, or situated to be more of a call for practitioners to perceive more of the interaction or the relations as opposed to the final product of some particular pattern of play or movement pattern itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? What kind of ecological or ecology kind of means to you from reading this paper? And is ecological a good description, I think, of what we're trying to do? Any thoughts on that?
I'll
sorry.
Yeah. I think so, and if we want to make it a bit, debatable and whatever, and we'll get Woodsy to respond. But so I think part of I totally agree with the premise, if you like, that what Woodsy's putting forward. And I think he makes a comment somewhere in the paper that typically, and if I think of most of the coaches I've ever worked with, everything's focused on the individual and what the individual is capable of doing or producing. And quite often it's always decoupled from what the environment's affording them. So I think how we convey that to coaches, that is, when you boil it down, that's the most critical piece of information that I take from this paper and the terrific work that many different researchers around the world are doing in this space. So I think our challenge comes from almost, it's represented in Woodsy's title there, that we've got to, if we really want to influence practitioners, we need to, the language is quite inaccessible, I find. And so when I deal with coaches, we have to find ways to simplify the message. Otherwise, they're not reading this type of material regularly. And I know this is written for a scientific audience, but that to me tends to be the problem. And then that manifests in the way in which coaches conceptualize what this means. And I'm sure we'll talk about that as we work through. So I'll just sort of leave that as an opening remark, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, Damian. I get that a lot from people about, the kind of the terminology in this area sometimes. And I think one of the terms you use, Carl, is organismic asymmetry, right? And I think that's kind of, both of you guys were talking about that. This asymmetry where we think all skill is with the individual, like in your head and a representation. But I'm sure also, I think also you're trying to make the point that asymmetry between the coach and the traditional approach of the coaching is there's this asymmetry of the coach as the instructor, that I know everything and I'm going to give you the answers. We're trying to change that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really integral part as well. And I think, like Damo said, there's some really great practitioners or practitioner scientists, right, around the world that really promote that message of like co-designing the environment. So we talk about practitioners being sport ecology designers, but an integral part of that designing framework, I think, and a few others think as well, is that it should be a kind of interaction between the coach and the athlete. So it's less about the coach saying to the athlete or athletes, this is how I think we should play, even in the wording that I use then, using a word like this is how I think we should play. It becomes more of so how do we think we should play, with a bit of an interaction between the performer and the kind of practitioner. So it becomes much more of a conversation as opposed to it being a closed-ended do it this way. And I guess to just regress slightly to Damo's point, I think an important part on the kind of language used in this space is absolutely on the money. But I a bit of a call within this paper as well was for people like ourselves on this call to perhaps integrate case examples of how these notions are brought to life as well within the practitioner sense. So it's kind of like the information that's conveyed within the paper is then scaffolded through the presentation of an exemplar or exemplars at the back end of or interspersed throughout the manuscript itself. But yeah, I think that's both of those points I think are really integral, is that it's an interaction not between just an organism and their environment, but between the organism and perhaps some kind of coach or some kind of figure that sits alongside them rather than sitting on top of this kind of notion of conveying knowledge down. It's more of an interaction on more of a horizontal scale, I think.
Yeah. And Alex, you mentioned you, as a coach, some of these motor learning ideas kind of resonated with you and were related to what you were doing. Is this this idea of this kind of interacting, focus more on the athlete and their environment? Is that something in particular that you could relate to?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the hardest part is having that conversation with other coaches. And that's been the hardest part of my PhD, is starting that conversation and finding the right angle to tap into their knowledge so they don't feel like they're relinquishing control. And I think the way that the paper was written was really interesting because it doesn't take the coach out of their role. It's just sort of redefining what the parameters of your role is. We really struggled with through coach education in sports, because we've been so focused on trying to shove as much information to someone as possible in one day and giving them a taste test of skill acquisition and biomechanics and anything that you can think of. But then they walk away not knowing how to do any of it at all. And it ends up misconstrued the second that they walk back onto the field. And so highlighting the way that you can still control, manipulate the environment that you're working with for the benefit of the athlete because you've spoken to them. I think that's a really important message to highlight, because it just gets lost so quickly the second that you read a paper and they walk away.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, I think. And I think, we could talk more about questioning and how you use that. And also, I agree, Carl, the cases you give. I think this is becoming increasingly more important. I've been talking about people with this. I think we need to specifically illustrate how these things work. I think that's to understand them. Derek, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, large part of what you try to do is disseminate the science and the research. And so what's your experience been like, in terms of the terminology and barrier and getting these ideas out to coaches? What has your experience been like?
Yeah. I would wholeheartedly agree with Damo in the sense that I think like the concepts that the ecological dynamics realm sort of conveys are very important, but a lot of coaches have difficulty understanding what that means for them because the language is a big barrier. At the end of the day, it's really tough to access some of those things like asymmetries, synergies, those types of things. And I've actually found that really, really filtering out a lot of the, I guess, to use an ecological, the noise and separating, what's actually relevant, and almost being a translator is really important, because otherwise they really struggle to I guess, find their footing in stuff like the research literature, which is, again, I'd agree with Carl here, the idea of having case studies in these types of research is really important, because it shows how that's actually lived. I've actually, shameless plug here, I've actually sort of just finished sort of designing a coaching experience. I don't want to call it a course, because I think course again implies that sort of top-down conveyance of knowledge, but where coaches get the opportunity to sort of learn from each other and talk about what some of these principles mean. And so like that case study idea makes it really accessible, but not. And then to Alex's point, then also sort of seeing where if other coaches can do it, I can do it too. So seeing that gives them the confidence to be able to build that knowledge and use it. So talking to people and saying, okay, well, how do we cut through some of the jargon and whatnot here and say, okay, well, this is what it actually looks like when you're on the ground. is really important. So, I think I've sort of touched on all three of the different comments there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I guess going back to the terminology, Damon, do you think we're overcomplicating it? Is it kind of jargony, getting to a jargony point, or is it worthwhile learning what these mean and they have specific meaning? What do you kind of think is the way forward with?
Yeah. Well, I think it's audience specific. So if you're a scientist in the field, you need to know the language and the jargon. That's just part and parcel of being a scientist. And so words are important, right? So we all appreciate that. And I think particularly given the significant shift, paradigm shift that ecological dynamics is bringing to sport and skill training, we have to sort of honour that to allow that shift to occur. Otherwise, we can fall back and use some language that might be theoretically really inconsistent. So at a scientific forum, I think absolutely we talk the language, and we should talk the language. Where I think what we're all sort of saying in different ways really is that what we're finding is when then you interface with a coach, they may or may not have had some coach education from some sort of traditional format in years gone by. They've read something in popular science or whatever. They've talked to other coaches, and so they've got a different language. And so do we want to spend all our time changing the language, or do we want to just get in and change their, help try and facilitate a change in their behaviour? And so depending on the nature of your relationship, the type of coach you're working with, I think you can, again, you can do both, but you want some clarity. So for me, it's a good example would be we talk about representative or we talk about specificity. Coaches don't really care. They get the concept, whichever word you use, if it's explained appropriately, that, okay, we're trying to lift out an aspect of performance here and recreate that to enhance the athlete's performance, or let them sample a different way of doing something. So that to me is the key thing, whether we use the word representative or specificity. At a scientific conference, well, use the word that you mean.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I think another challenge with this, and maybe Carl, I think is the case studies illustrate this well for me. Like the two case studies you give, there's nothing, the actual manipulations made in the case studies, there's nothing particularly new or innovative about the actual manipulations. It's the terminology and the interpretation that you apply to them, right? In the way that you break them down. That's the innovate. This is a reaction they get a lot to ecological. That you may have heard people use, it's old wine in new bottles, right? It's manipulations people have been using for years and years, like small-sided games or whatever, and you're just giving these fancy jargon on top of it. But I think there's more than that, but it's hard to explain what it is without getting into the actual the nuts and bolts.
To kind of indulge in a little ecological approach, I think it's the difference between knowledge of and knowledge about, right? Like I think there's a difference, like what Damo was saying. People like myself, Alex, Derek, these kind of, like I don't perceive myself as a theoretical scientist, right? I see myself probably more as a practitioner scientist or scientist practitioner. So I think there's an important understanding here that I need to know the nuances of what I am preaching, right? But so I need to know of them. I need to actually live these notions, so like representative design, for argument's sake. And using that exact example because we've written about it in another paper, which will hopefully be released soon, in that to convey that type of concept to a coach, it's as simple as I found, at least with coaches that I've worked with over the years, is using words like, did that training activity look game-like to you? Okay. Now, that type of question evokes exactly what I want to kind of extract the information that I want to extract, but it allows them to frame it in a way that's of meaning to them, right? Instead of me saying, how representative was that activity or was the action fidelity representative of what would be exposed in a game? Like that's not the time nor the place. but simply probing a question as, did that look game-like? I think then it allows the coach to draw upon their experiential knowledge that is the really rich stuff, right? I mean, that's the stuff that wins us games of footy or loses us games of footy, right? It's not necessarily whether or not they understand the difference between representative learning design and kind of specificity of practice. It's really if we're able to channel that information in a way that's digestible for the coach. And that's what I mean by knowledge of and knowledge about. I think this notion of kind of these contemporary practices aren't necessarily contemporary. I think there's lots of validity in that because I spend a lot of my days now reading things in like social anthropology, and people like Tim Ingold have been proposing these things back in the early 90s, and now I think we're writing about them in a contemporary lens in this day and age. But again, I think it comes back to being able to convey that knowledge in a useful way for a coach, which is this difference between knowledge of and knowledge about. I think it's being able to, the difference between a coach saying, yeah, I understand representative learning design, and a coach that goes, well, I don't really understand the specific terminology of representative learning design, but I know the importance of making sure that I keep defenders in this particular activity because we're practicing offense, and to really ensure our offense is often singing, I need to challenge them against different defenders or different types of defenders, right? I'm sure the coaches I've worked with in the past mightn't be able to explain the real specifics of the information regulating action, but they will definitely be able to say that that's really important because that helps us see how the players respond when a defender runs at them, or how a player responds when a defender holds off of them, or how a player responds when a defence adopts more of a gap control type strategy against them. So I've kind of gone down a few tangents there, but I guess that's my take on it, is that I think there's this notion of it being not contemporary, but I perhaps take more of an understanding that people like ourselves and people all over the world that are doing a great job of it needed a knowledge of it, but we need to convey it in a way that is easily digested for practitioners at all different levels of sport, not just in high performance sport, but exactly like people like you had on the other day, Rob, like James Rudd, who's doing a great job of this, but in a physical literacy sense for teachers, for educators in schools. So, that's at least my take on that notion of being kind of what is old is new type thing.
Yeah. No, sorry, go ahead, Derek. Yeah.
I was going to say, can I ask sort of a follow-up question? Because I think it maybe ties in nicely. I guess one of the things that sort of popped up in my reading of this was, and I don't know if I'm glad Carl's here because he can sort of clarify this, is maybe the suggestion that coaches need to have a theoretical basis then for what they do. Is it like, so my read on that is that, okay, well, coaches need to understand, I have to have a better understanding of the theory. And this is something I've heard before. And I'm just wondering, is that sort of the way that what you've meant in the paper?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough one because the scientist in me says yes, right? So the scientist in me says, yeah, they need a better understanding of the theoretical construct. But I guess the practitioner in me says, so what? Like if I'm doing this in a way that I'm seeing results, then I don't necessarily need to know what goes on behind the curtain. But I guess my own personal belief is that we need a foundation that informs our ecology or our practice ecology, right? Like we can't just be this, I don't think, and I know this probably might be a point of difference, particularly maybe for Damo and yourself, but I don't necessarily think that we get the most out of what we do by kind of, bobbing in the ocean. I think there needs to be a really solid foundation underneath of what they perceive or their ideology. Now, whether that's ecological dynamics, I clearly think it should be. But whether that's something else, I think a coach needs a firm understanding of what they're trying to do and work within the principles of that rather than constantly going, that looks cool, I'll use that. That looks cool, I'll use that. That looks cool, I'll use that. Because then they become this, I think in this recent thing that you spoke about, Alex, maybe like a helicopter coach, like they become this person that kind of follows all these little trails without having something. Now, that's not to say that our underpinning beliefs should bias us against things. I don't think we should go, no, I can't use the word like cognitive map in ecological dynamics because I'd be, chastised at a conference for it. But I think what we need is a greater appreciation of an underpinning set of principles to inform some particular practice. That's what I worked really hard at Port with our coaches was establishing a unifying framework for performance preparation that was informed by ecological dynamics, but wasn't informed by ecological dynamics, if that made sense. So it was informed, the principles that we put in place, I at least had a foundation of understanding of where they were, but it was written and created in a way that the coaches within that framework felt comfortable that they had enough ownership over what was going on.
Yeah.
You're almost making it more palatable, essentially.
Yeah. Is that what you find as well, Alex?
Yeah, I think the conversations have definitely digressed so many times. And I find that picking the ideas that the coaches already come with, so they're preconceived ideas. A lot of people probably have some sort of a philosophy or anything like that. And sometimes it's just a matter of highlighting that this already exists in their underpinnings. They just didn't know why. And a lot of the things that we pick up, we don't understand where they come from. When I ask a coach why they do something, they can't always answer where they got it. Most of the time, it's just, this is how I was trained as a kid. And so almost getting out of that automatic thinking and encouraging people to be like, well, why do I train in the nets instead of on the open field that's next to me? Or what can I do given this is my set of circumstances? I think we're just questioning coaches essentially and giving the opportunity to reflect on their own practice. And when you have an underpinning framework that they understand, I think it's probably one of the best ways to integrate it into a club like that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Damian? The role of theory in coaching. Do you think there's a value in understanding the theories to a certain degree? Obviously, not. You're right. There's this division that we always talk in academia and coaching.
I think you got to understand why you're doing something. Mm-hmm. So if that's what we mean, which is I think what Carl's really saying. So because you're right, coaches just continue to grab at whatever they think's the next hottest item. So if you have a theoretical understanding or a level of understanding, so you can look at training and say, okay, if you're the head coach in a professional team or the like, and Carl's paper, we probably get to it later, the department of methodology concept. So your service team, right, and how they interface. So I'm the head coach and I look over and I see my strength and conditioning coach having our athletes run around cones to do agility training, as an example, or, the flashing lights that you can buy and they react to the flashing lights. So as a coach, you're responsible for the program. So I think there's a responsibility there for you to be able to look over at that and go, how does that sit within what I understand to be good practice design? So to answer that, you probably do need some sort of theoretical background. Maybe theory is the wrong word, but the underpinning basis of why it's important to represent practice appropriately. Okay, so what Carl suggested he's done with the Port coaches, and having now working with one of those coaches that's moved from that organisation, he clearly has this coach has this understanding. He mightn't be able to quote to me scientific literature, but I know he understands the concept through his actions. So I think there's an example in Carl's paper about that as well, that the players, it's with the questioning you engage, it's what do we see from them when they perform, right? That tells you how much they genuinely understand a concept. So I think it is important, and it's probably more about what are is there a few key things that we really need to make sure are non-negotiables for coaches? And I don't think we should call it theoretical understanding. We should just call it something else to remove that stereotype a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's on the money. Like I think you're right. I think theory is the wrong word. It's just a deeper level of understanding of why we're doing something, which is kind of linking back to your point, Alex. If if I'm asked, okay, well, why are we doing this particular activity? There's at least a rationale behind you. There's like a method to your madness, I guess. That's at least, and yeah, exactly. Whether it's being able to recite a theory is probably neither here nor there. It would excite, obviously, someone like myself would be, oh, sweet, how good is this? But in terms of the functionality of it, it's as long as there's a basis for understanding why they're doing what they're doing, I think is the more integral part.
Yeah.
And the other thing, just to weigh in, I think it also provides a level of comfort if you've got an understanding of what you're trying to do, a deeper understanding. So one of the challenges that I've seen with coaches looking to enhance their practice design, and it's a perennial one, right? I'm sure we've all experienced it, but it takes time. So adaptation takes time. And the more high performance you go, the less time they perceive they have. I think they've got plenty, but they perceive they have very little time, right? Mm-hmm. And so understanding that adaptation takes time, it might influence how long they persist with an activity for, rather than I'll schedule it for 20 minutes on a main session on a Wednesday, but that's all we're giving it, right? And then we're moving on. So it really does start to permeate a lot of decision-making that a coach has to work through.
And maybe on that, jumping the gun a little bit, Rob, maybe like Damo said, that's the importance, and that's why we really needed to get that in. We felt we needed to get that in the paper through this concept. It's Martin Rothwell's concept of a department of methodology. Like I think this unification of practice in all aspects of performance preparation. It's not just like, 20 minutes on a Wednesday, that's our ecological drill. Like it doesn't work like that, and it can't work like that, which is the risk I think practitioners take by cherry picking things. I think you then, you try to do a lot, but you get nothing. When I think that the key is to have a unification such that, we're obviously proposing an ecological approach, but that would inform training design, that would inform how we analyse our training sessions and analyse our performance. That would be how we view an opposition and how they subsequently interact with our players. That would then implicate how we question and educate off the field, so in classrooms, so to speak. That then implicates how we train in the weights room. So it filters through the broader scope of the organisation, but it's the unification of practice that's the integral part. Now, whether that's theoretical or whether that's a kind of organisation way of doing, I'm neither here nor there really. I'm more inclined that how it's being done is being driven, like we talk about it more recently in this hunting and gathering sense, where it's the prey that is the unifying target, and then you have all these people within this group that work together to get that prey. So it might be the strength coach, it might be the footy, the head coach, it might be a performance analyst. How they go about doing their jobs is really nuanced to their jobs, but it's still being unified by a global framework of this is how we perceive performance in this sense, or in this ecological sense.
Yeah. No, I think those are really important points, and I agree completely with all of you saying, Alex and Carl and Damian. I think the consistency for me is the most important thing. Maybe not understanding why, but what this cherry picking or helicopter, I think I'm starting to see that. Like, I'll get people that approach me and say, I really believe in self-organization after people learn the fundamentals first. Like, that you don't believe in, so like, you don't know what I mean, right? So playing both sides of the fence and cherry picking is going to lead to a lot of ineffective practices, in my view, right? You can use the same manipulations, variability, to build a motor program or encourage self-organization, and you have to decide what you're trying to do, right? I think that's for me the main point, and which way you choose, and so I think that's a really important point. And the Department of Methodology, I wanted to from that. There's another point I wanted to ask you about, Carl. Maybe we could talk about. I thought the idea of system capture was really interesting I think that's a really important issue, I think, because, so maybe we could talk a little bit about what that is. I think it's something that's really hard for coaches to avoid, I think, in a lot of situations, not only being drawn into, it puts pressure on them that makes it hard to switch. Like Damian was saying, some of these things take long long time to show effects, and they might not have that time as a coach. Yeah.
I think that's a really, really important point. I'd be really interested in Derek's take on it too, because in other sports, but Australian footy has like this underlying socio-cultural way of doing, right, which Damo would know about. So it's this historic. This is the way we train. This is the way we educate. This is how we do things. And it's not to say that these ways are bad, right? But I think what the call for this is to constantly be aware, going back to why we're doing things. And I think if the reason behind why we're doing things is because we've always done it this way, then that's wrong. That's not the right way to do it. So this notion of system capture that we're trying to promote is that we're actually trying to break away from a path-dependent behaviour. Like it's this notion of, well, I've always coached this way, so this is the way I'm going to continue to coach. Now, I think there's a really important underlying theme into that, which is this sense of introspection and reflection as to what you actually are as a coach, what you perceive yourself is as a coach, because that reflection constantly helps you to understand, or at least understand why you're doing something. And I don't think we can innovate without really being reflective upon why we're doing something, because I tend to find, at least in my experience, there's this kind of follow the leader mentality. It's like, oh, this team and this coach is doing this, so we got to now go and do that, right? Well, that's kind of like the wrong way, I think, of doing it. It has to be, well, why did they go about doing that? Why are they training in this way? Why are they educating this way? Why are they focusing on this? That leads to this kind of constant questioning of, are we really doing something that we think is right, or are we actually doing something that is kind of we're subconsciously drawn into because it's always been the way of doing. I'm massively I've been sucked into that from a scientific perspective over the years. Like I've done written papers because I'm like, oh, that's the way we do it in this area. Well, why? Like, why can't we write this way? Why can't I analyze data this way? Why can't I, use a provocative question somewhere in a manuscript which challenges this historical way of doing? That's how that's at least that was the emphasis that we tried to push in that, is that Department of Methodology is perhaps a really great way of avoiding these pitfalls of, we're doing it this way because we've always done it this way.
Yeah. What's your experience been with that, like about that, Derek, about this, breaking this, that's the way we always do it? And also, I guess we could also talk about, one of the main points of your paper also is we've talked about the shift of coached from instructor to a designer. That's a big shift, I know, for a lot of people. What's your experience been with those kind of things, Derek?
Yeah, well, I think so. I guess picking up on that last point there. So I think good coaches will eventually I'll start again. I don't think a lot of the stuff that we're doing, in sort of the skill development, skill acquisition world is super revolutionary in terms of the coaching world. Like, good coaches will eventually start to hone in on a lot of these concepts through experience. I think what the real advantage that we bring to the table is giving them options earlier in the piece and challenging them and getting them to think about what they're doing. If I think about, this, a lot of what we're talking about comes down to being really reflective as a coach and saying, okay, well, what works and what doesn't work? And I think it's really easy to get caught up in the day-to-day as a coach. And that's why it's really easy to sort of say, okay, well, I saw that shiny new thing, I'm going to go chase it. Or I saw that shiny new thing, I'm going to go chase it. And so one of the biggest things that I found has the most impact with coaches is just sitting down and, getting them to ask simple questions like, what are you doing that's effective? Mm-hmm. What are you doing that you need to change? And what do you want to do? at the end of the day. So it's sort of putting a stake in the ground and saying, okay, well, this is what I value as a coach. This is, my personal theory, and however they sort of play that out, but then sort of saying, okay, well, what am I doing well here? And what am I not doing well? And then and then sort of, if you follow those paths and are really diligent with the way you follow them, then you get better results. And so there's no real magic to it in my mind. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it. And I think, like this department of methodology, personally, I don't think the concept isn't necessarily revolutionary. I guess what it's trying to propose is that we're gathering around a single thing, and we're making sure that everyone lives that thing. Mm-hmm. And completely unbiased here, but I think sort of that skill development piece is a big part of it. Like that's, ultimately as a coach, as an S&C, as a sports psychologist, that's what you want. You want to get these athletes performing their best. So, let's find out what that is and what that looks like. And that's kind of, where we go. And that's sort of, I guess, what in my mind, the Department of Methodology does. I don't know, necessarily if that's the thing to call it or anything like that, but it's good practice in my mind. Yeah.
What about you, Damian? You mentioned this Department of Methodology. Have you seen this in some of the places you work, or try to integrate? We tend to be very siloed in the way we train athletes.
Certainly in professional sport and through my time at the AIS, it comes under various titles. Often it's called the service team. Mm-hmm. And so you'll meet, maybe depending on the environment, it could be as much as daily. It can be a couple of times a week or once a week, whatever it might be. But what was also pretty apparent and probably the key difference is that is these individual people all sort of coming together. And it might be you've got a problem with a particular athlete and we're all invited to try and help solve the issue, whatever the issue might be. It might be a technical issue, for example. So that's a swimmer and they're not, raising their elbow appropriately while they're doing freestyle. Mm-hmm. So the coach will say, this is what I've tried, it's not working. I'll whack my hand up and go, oh, have you done X? The strength and conditioning coach will go, oh, well, that's a core strength issue. We need to put them back in the gym for longer before we even try that technique. Psychologist goes, oh, no, they're really nervous. It's just that you've been sweating on this technical change for that long. They've got it stuck now. So my experience of service team meetings is everyone wants to have a piece of the pie, so to speak, from their discipline-specific knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so the need for some way of unifying is really important, but equally coaches are often not trained to be that person that can connect the dots. And so they will use their experience and often make good decisions about, okay, we're going to start in the gym. Mm-hmm. But in terms of that being unified by a theory, I haven't really seen it very often at all. And hence why my example earlier, I feel the skill, whatever you want to call it, the skill acquisition field has a lot to share with the strength and conditioning field. And there's some individuals around the world that are doing a great job of trying to connect that. Mm-hmm. But equally, you see, very different methodologies used to develop performance. So clearly, we're a fair way from this utopia of working collaboratively from the same unifying theory, I think, based on my experience anyway. So I don't know if I've answered your question. So
no,
I think conceptually it's a good idea, but we're a fair way from being able to do it.
Yeah. What about you, Alex? Have you had experience with this kind of interaction with different coaching disciplines? And
I actually found it was easier for me to go and educate myself to pretend to be all of those roles than to try to work together. Honestly, that's one of the hardest parts I found about coaching is that if you want to put the head coach hat on, you don't get to wear any of the other hats either. And so I can't go into a team and say, well, I'm actually trained in psychology as well, or I have an entire PhD on talent development. They don't care. You're the head coach. That's your role. That's it. And so they actually silo the teams as well. And so all that experience then apparently doesn't contribute to my coaching either. And so I found it as a really weird interaction between what you're able to do in research and what you're able to do in practice and how much that is valued. If I actually mention I'm an academic, that decreases my ability to get a coaching job. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of represents the fact that we have this grand unified idea of what we need to be doing. But when one person tries to do that, no, that's not how it works. We need a whole team to do that. Well, do we? Really?
No, I think...
my experience.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences. Sorry, Derek, go ahead.
I think that's a great point too. Like, like this department of methodology thing works really well at sort of the more elite level where you've got different people. But I mean, you know, as a coach, then you've almost got to become your own department of methodology. And you know, I think it comes back to this idea of having a really clear purpose behind what you want to do and taking time to reflect. Yeah.
No, I think that's a real key point. I think, you know, what we're trying to do here is like add a bit of structure to the experiential knowledge. So the analogy I sometimes use of what I think ecological dynamics is trying to achieve is take coaches from just using recipes to being chefs.
Yeah.
So understanding why these two ingredients go together so you can make a new recipe. That's why sometimes it looks old, because they're old recipes, but we're not always trying to propose something completely new, we're just trying to put a new, why does that work? Why do we think that caused the benefits that you're seeing? So you're right. I think, Derek, coaches have this amazing ability as in like a laboratory experimenters of finding recipes that work. I think, and they have an intuitive understanding of why they do. So I think that's a really, really good point. Alex, what is your, I wanted to go back to this in this, coach as an instructor versus a designer. What's your experience been like that yourself, or, you know, working with people, that transition?
I actually, funnily enough, just wrote a small article about the fact that I reflected on all the experiences I had as a kid going through the pathway, and I found it intolerable to go to training. I actually didn't look forward to go to training at all, because I knew that I walked in there and picked something up, they'd be like, why are you holding it like that? That's not the way you should be holding it. She's not holding it like that. I really didn't care. Like, I just wanted to be able to try the task that we were going to be doing, and that's it. And so I started to wonder, why do we stop people in the middle of their tracks and tell them to do something when chances are they'd come to their own conclusion eventually, right? I mean, we do the same with the school curriculum as well. Even now, you get to pick your own assignment topics. I mean, your experience in sport shouldn't have to be that much different than that. And so when I then turned around and asked coaches the same thing, well, why didn't you let her just, you know, go on with what she was doing and eventually she'd work it out? They're like, we don't have time for that. We don't have time for her to explore. We don't have time. We only have 30 minutes in the nets. Like, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to let her sit there and make the same mistake over and over again? Well, yes, because eventually she'll mistake. But unless you've set up that idea and asked that question, maybe they don't even think it's a mistake. Maybe it's only a mistake because it doesn't look like what you're doing. And so breaking down that barrier to the fact that people are going to have unique solutions to their problems, I think that's when you realize that's the time that you switch over from being an instructor to a designer. And so I always start my sessions, or when I take a new team or anything like that, the first thing I say is, I'm not going to show you anything. I'm not going to demonstrate it. Because we are completely different people. I coach children. Like, yes, we're probably relatively of the same height, but that doesn't mean that we have similar solutions to a problem. And so I don't want them to think that just because I can do it one way, that's the way that they should be doing it. And so I think that's the day that I switched between an instructor to a designer. And now I just challenge other people, well, why do you do it that way? Because I'm actually genuinely curious to know, like, where do people go to find new information or to answer that question?
Yeah. No, I think those are great points. And it made me think of something I think this paper also does a good job talking about, Carl, and maybe I'll ask Damian about this misconception that this approach is hands-off coaching. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, and where I think you make a good point, Carl, it's actually harder in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I was actually going to say, in response to Alex's point, and it sort of flows on anyway, but it is hard coaching. Like, you've got to know your sport super well to coach effectively in this manner, this hands-off manner. Mm-hmm. And I think it was Rick Shuttleworth, who's a really good applied, whatever you want to call it, theoretical applied scientist in this space as well. He introduced to us when he was working at the AIS the use of like a constraints table. So when we would meet and work with coaches, we'd start to get them to think about all the different constraints they might be able to manipulate in a given task. And very quickly you fill a page or pages, and then you start to get them to think about sequencing those. So, okay, if we're going to start with constraint A, where would we go next if that doesn't work? So the cricket example that we had, they're still not hitting the ball effectively. So what's the next lever that you pull as coach? And then what's the next lever? And so we start with that quite frequently. I still use it a lot in terms of getting the coach so that's that preparation before training. And then from a coaching point of view, you have to stand back and watch to see whether that's occurring. You can't be involved. One of my greatest frustrations is, and I see it in all levels of sport, is the coach, they love the sport, they probably played the sport, but they love it that much that they still run around on the field with the players. So I see it at the elite level and I see it at the junior level. And it's like, get out of the way, stand back, get hands off, observe, and then pull some levers. Use your constraints table to influence the progression that might be occurring within a given session. So for me, it's really difficult. And that's where I think that's also our challenge, because if you go down one level of coaching to a community level, that's fundamentally what we're asking people there to do, which is a really difficult thing to do. So that's why they gravitate to a recipe. Mm-hmm. But I don't think there's any excuse when you get up to the high performance level that you should be able to stand back and facilitate more hands-off coaching. But again, there's just all these, we've always done it this way. We're always on the deck with the players. That's how we do it. And it's like, well, it's interesting. On game day, you sit up in the stands and you send messages every now and then, and you just study, and you have your performance analyst sitting next to you feeding you statistical data about what's happening. So when are you practicing that? Why aren't you using that to inform your practice? So you can have some really fun, challenging conversations with coaches about what hands-off really is. And ultimately, those that get it walk away going, yeah, this is pretty complex. And I actually have to be a really good coach to do it. And then that's where you sort of can have a breakthrough if it sort of gets the ego engaged a little bit.
Yeah. What about you, Derek? Sorry, I was going to
say one of the things I really like to do, just even simplifying just the constraints table, to make it a little bit simpler. One of the things I like is, okay, well, what's your favorite drill or activity for teaching this skill? And then diagram it out. And then I'm like, okay, if that skill is if that drill isn't going well, how, let's say, okay, well, what's the one thing that you can change to make it easier? Okay, then they design that one, and then I say, okay, well, what's something we can change to make it a little bit more challenging if they're finding it too easy? And then so, from that one drill, all of a sudden, they've designed two things that they've got ready to go right away. And, so I think it's starting to drip feed people, how this actually works and what it looks like is really powerful, because they all of a sudden realize, geez, this is actually not as difficult as I thought. And they start going through all these different permutations. But, for me, I think that's a great starting point, put together the list, but then actually design something that says, okay, I've got 3 different drills in my pocket in case, the one that I start with doesn't work the way I want it to.
Yeah.
I actually did that recently. I was just going to say I just completed an intervention study at the community level because they've received pretty much no coaching whatsoever. And so what better place to try representative task design than the people who've probably never heard about it. And one of the hardest things I'm finding is the best way to tell other coaches how I did it. Like, how do we even go about researching or developing a training session that we've come up with off the top of our heads because this information comes so easily to us? But how do I then get somebody else to pick up this intervention and be like, oh my God, I could do that on a Tuesday night? That'd be so easy. They only need 20 minutes. And so communicating that I found is really hard because, the more tables that you make, they think that it has to be, 10 pages long, when really all you need to be able to identify is the skill that you're working on in the first place.
I think an integral part of that too, at least what I found with this mentality of hands-off coaching, is you actually uncover really cool solutions that you never thought in the first place from the athletes themselves. So if you actually sit back and observe what's going on, and you set some constraints in place, and you see these really creative and adaptable solutions emerge, and you celebrate those as opposed to this constant desire, because I think this is where we've got to get really careful with constraints too, is that we don't constrain to push towards a rigid movement, right? We constrain to afford solutions. So I think we need to spend more time celebrating the emergent solutions from the constraints that we put in place, not necessarily this notion of, well, I'm using constraints, I'm not telling them what to do, but I've constrained it such that they can only move their arm in a certain way, or that they can only kick to that particular player. No, I think we need to be very, very careful. And this is the difficulty, which is what Damo was talking about, and the importance of planning with this, is that we constrain to afford opportunities, and we celebrate those opportunities, which comes back to how we analyse performance, right? Like, I think that's the really integral part of ecological dynamics is how we then analyse the effectiveness of a constraint that was put in place relative to what we put the constraint in place for. And I think that's the really fun part, I think, of analysing performance, because you're not watching tape back, so to speak, for how well they performed an action relative to a standard that you've put in place based upon, the constraints that you use. But perhaps you can start to watch training back and go, whoa, did you see that slight movement that they did in response to some particular constraint that we put in place? Or did you see how they exploited that rule? It's probably something that annoys Damo a lot, is that as someone that trains umpires, right, my job in sport is to help our players educate ways to exploit the rules that the umpires are trying to enforce. So how we can do that in really fun and manipulative ways to and celebrate the emergent adaptability from the constraints that we put in place, which might challenge this notion of you perform in Alex's world, you perform a straight drive in this way. Well, if we've constrained an environment that affords that opportunity, then I don't really mind necessarily how that straight drive has occurred. I'm more interested in how they've been able to adapt to that particular constraint that we've put in place.
Mm-hmm. And the way we measure things too sometimes is a constraint. I look at some of the measures that we look at for footwork, and an adaptive movement actually scores less than a confident movement, or being right in the first time. I'm like, well, is that really wrong, or did they just completely change the situation that they should have not been successful in and turn it into a successful one? Why am I deducting points for that?
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's a real important point you make, Carl, and Alex too. They're both in this paper, especially with the case studies, the importance of observation and describing the phenomenon. I know, Damon, like, for example, the work you've done with Tim in like cataloging variability between and within, like how important is, I don't think we do enough of that. Like, look, just actually observe how the things we do in practice change behavior and describe it and things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I find that to be one of our greatest challenges. So to use a parallel from, say, physiology, they can put a heart rate monitor on and measure performance in some way, shape or form, whereas skill is harder to see in some respects, depending on how you want to define it, but progression is harder to see. So you can play a particular game or activity like the ones in the paper, and you might see the emergence of some really cool, fakes and different deceptive actions. And you go, okay, so is that going to carry through to the weekend? And so we struggle to be able to understand whether skill is actually getting better for performance terms. So from my point of view, if we can somehow contextualize what we're seeing, and so if we talk about, task switching or the like, if it's from a practice variability point of view, we want to appreciate, well, when does performance need to change, or when do we as coaches who are observing, when do we need to maybe start to question the athletes or ask them to try a different challenge, so that we're not getting this plateau in performance that tends to occur, that we, traditionally would go, oh, good, they've learned this, when we all know that that's, probably the most dangerous point practice. They need to be challenged again. So for me, that's it's easy said. High performance environments, you might be able to record and model it like we've done with some of those papers, but a coach without that sort of performance analytics behind them, they need to be able to at least understand and stand back and watch and have some sort of metric of performance in their mind that they can use to go, okay, it's time to shift, or no, we can persist with this activity for a little bit longer. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think Carl's paper has some comment on that. When is variability functional and when does it become detrimental? So if we then talk more about the actual the movement patterns potentially, I think, again, that's really challenging. We don't all have biomechanists that can assist with the measurement in that respect. So knowing, I think that the U shape is a nice way to conceptualize it relative to skill level. But again, educating coaches about, hey, it's okay. Let it roll. You're dealing with a youth athlete who's going through puberty. You're going to get variability, okay? And so don't coach something that might rectify itself in 6 months' time when they've gone through puberty. Mm-hmm. So it's being able to, I suppose, provide some tools to the coach, and some of it's just awareness and understanding, like we touched on earlier.
Yeah, I think it really
go ahead,
part of that. Yeah, sorry, Rob. I think a really important part of that as well, Damo, is more so at the grassroots level, but absolutely at the high performance level. We often perceive that we as the coaches or practitioners know when learning has occurred, right? But I think we need a greater understanding of what the athletes are perceiving. So, it could be as simple as a coach at a junior level or at a high performance level, putting a challenge in place or creating a challenge within an activity. After that challenge, simply asking the athlete, how challenging was that? 0 being not at all, 5 being, man, I couldn't solve that problem at all. Because I think that starts to tell us where we're surfing that challenge point for the athlete. They might turn around and say, yeah, mate, that was like 1 out of 5. That was super easy. All right, sweet. Next time, I might, instead of giving you 20 seconds to move the ball from this part to this part, I might tighten that up to 15 seconds. That was way too hard. It felt like it was just not game-like. It was like too difficult. And that, as a resultant of it, wasn't really, in my world, wouldn't be a representative activity from that seat. So again, I think this notion of co-design comes back to simply asking the players, and it can be as simple as a coach just having a basic interaction with their players. How difficult was that? Do you feel like that made you any better as a footy player or as a soccer player or as a cricket player? Do you feel like the design that we put in place, felt game-like? I think that's such a simple thing to do, but at least in my experience, out of all these kind of fancy gadgets that we might have in high performance environments, that's often looked over, but it's a really integral part, I think, of determining how effective or affective your learning environment is, and whether or not an individual or an athlete is actually feeling like they're getting better based upon the designs that you put in place. Just ask them, as opposed to trying to guess that. Yeah, I think they're at a stage where I can perturb some movement now. Why don't you just talk to them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really and also good thing you emphasize in your paper, Carl. You're not denying the role of questioning and reflection in coaching, but just changing it from the knowledge about dimension, right? So not the same kind of reflection, not trying to describe what you did and every decision you made in terms of, but so using questioning in a different way. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean that comes back to some basics. I think of kind of it's probably a provocative term, but I still think there's a home for showing in an ecological dynamics framework, but we don't show in the historic sense of kind of like showing something and then saying this is the way to do it. I think we show by being very careful with how we interact or how we manipulate constraints, and that might be showing, right, if you can find some space in this field, I'm going to give you 2 points for that. So again, you're showing them kind of where to look, but you're not telling them what to see from that response. So I think that's a I think that's a really integral part of this notion of knowing when something has been learned or not. But I think it's an important part of really being aware, I think, at times that an ecological approach is just this notion of, I can't show them, I can't demonstrate it, I can't, and questioning just has to be a response to in some kind of action that we see on the field. No, I think it comes back to how we view what showing might be, what demonstration might be. It comes back to then how clever we can use constraints or whatever different features of our environment to interact the athlete or interact the athlete with their environment or amongst themselves or with us or whatever it might be.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Well, look, wow, the hour went by fast. I'll keep you. So I thought I'll go around and you maybe get a last thought from everybody. Anything you want, but one idea I had, if a coach is, maybe you have a path dependent coach, it's used to doing it always the same way. What's a way to get into this? Be more ecological, be more a designer. Is there? What would be your advice for a coach to kind of take the steps to go in those directions? Maybe I'll start with you, Damian. That'll give you a really hard, or any other final thought you want to have is fine too.
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Rob.
No problem.
Look, I think, for me, the one thing I would ask them to do is take themselves. Two things, actually. Take themselves out of the activity, because I find a lot of coaches get so absorbed in the activity that they're prescribing, they don't get to see what's happening. Mm-hmm. So if you don't see what's happening, it's really hard to then appreciate the role the environment's having on the performance. So take yourself out of the environment. And then the second point is to remind them what it felt like when they were a performer themselves. Most of them have come from being an athlete, maybe not elite, but they've played the sport. Remember what it was like to be a player. Remember the amount of information sources that you were dealing with when you're on the field, running around. There's people yelling, you're about to be tackled, you feel nervous, et cetera, et cetera. And then from that, really reinforce that, well, all of those emotions, feelings, physical, mental, et cetera, that's what you're really trying to recreate in some way, shape or form within the practice that you're designing with the athlete. So they'd probably be the two key points. Stand back and remember what it was like when you were an athlete.
Yeah, those are great. Alex, what are your thoughts about changing as a coach?
Yeah. 3 pages of notes. So. To make. I think the biggest thing is going to be don't assume that your players or your athletes can see the same things that you do. And so every time that you approach a session, you have to approach it with the same curiosity that you had when you were an athlete. And then maybe just identifying that forcing them to look somewhere doesn't mean they'll see it. I think that's probably one of my favorite quotes out of this whole thing is that we're not telling them what to see, but we're giving them the opportunity to identify that is a source of information. What are you going to do with it? What can you do with it? And so I think that's probably going to be my takeaway. The next time I have a conversation with a coach is, well, what are your players looking for? And when was the last time you asked them?
Mm-hmm. Derek, what's your final thought?
Shameless plug. Go to www.derekpanchuk.com. For my course, I'll teach you all the things.
Of course, that goes without saying.
I'm terrible at marketing. For me, those things really resonate as well. I guess figure out your purpose. Start with your why. Like to take a page out of Simon Sinek's book. Figure that out first, and then I guess echoing a little bit of what Damian said. Start with the end in mind. Figure out what this needs to look like in context in the game and work backwards from there. And then start stripping things back. But yeah, you always start there. So that's what I got.
Okay, good. Yeah. Carl, what do you?
I think everyone's pretty much summed it up perfectly. I'm really part of this. I guess it's a link back to Damo's point. Like I have this belief that none of us like being told what to do. Like I think back to when I was a kid. If my parents told me to do something, I'd probably make it my intent to do the opposite. So I think, based on that understanding that we don't like being constrained to do something, I think is a really important part of understanding that, think back to when you're an athlete or you're a player. How enjoyable was it to be told what to do by a coach, that it has to be done this way? I think that reflection is really important, because when at least the coaches that I've worked with over the last few years, when that kind of penny drops for them, they realise, like, yeah, I had this one coach that was always like, it has to be done this way, and it didn't fit how I played the game. Well, that should be a bit of an understanding that maybe there are other ways to do things, and maybe then the job of the coach shouldn't be to provide solutions per se, but it should be to kind of just nurture problems that the players then go off and solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think those are all great points. I haven't coached as nearly as much as you guys have, but I've had similar experience with teaching, from, moving from standing up there lecturing to people to where you actually get into discussion and you open up that, I don't know everything about this subject, let's figure it out together. It is a big jump. It's a kind of a jump for people, but it really makes it more rewarding for everybody, I think. So, well, thanks everyone. That was really fun, and thanks for people following along. I think we'll end it there. Thanks
for having us, Rob, and keep up the great work yourself.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks for the great discussion, gang. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.